The Reluctant Recluse. Mavis opened her eyes and looked across at the clock by the side of her bed. 6 a.m. Shivering slightly, she pulled the bedclothes up to her chin and turned over. No need to get up yet, she said to herself, and sighed as she thought about the long, lonely day that stretched out in front of her. The only time she felt happy these days was when she was in bed at night, that is, if she could sleep. Tossing and turning, she realised that she would not get back to sleep, so pushing the bedclothes back, she slowly sat up on the side of the bed. A sad, pathetic-looking figure, in baggy faded pyjamas, stick-thin legs protruding with thick woolly bet socks on her feet. Pulling on her dressing gown, she padded to the bathroom. It was light now, with the sun weakly trying to appear in the April morning sky. Looking in the mirror, she surveyed the face looking at her. Thin, worn and gaunt, with straggly hair escaping from the hairnet which she wore religiously every night, just one of her many rituals. At 69 she looked so much older than her years. She sighed as she remembered the lovely-looking girl she used to be. In fact, many people had remarked that she bore a striking resemblance to Princess Margaret. When she had dressed, she got herself breakfast, half a bowl of cereal with sugar and milk, a cup of strong coffee and the first cigarette of the day. Putting on the radio at her side, she sat listening to the traffic news and the weather forecast. She did this every morning, even though she knew she would not be going out and it would be no use to her. The flat was much the same as it was when her mother had been alive. Same teak furniture, now old-fashioned looking, same carpets and curtains, now faded, all the old familiar things which helped to make her feel safe. She could not cope with changes. She had not been out of her flat for 3 months. The last time had been when the ambulance came to take her for a check-up at the hospital. What a day that had been. Some might say a welcome intrusion into her sad and lonely existence, despite the fact that she had dreaded it for many days beforehand. I was pushed here and there, pillar to post, poked and prodded, and then asked endless questions, she muttered to herself. Afterwards, when it was all over, she was brought back to her lonely flat, dumped at the door, with no one to inquire how she had got on, or there to make her a welcome cup of tea. Oh, how she missed those little things that other people take for granted. Closing her eyes, she sighed and let her mind wander, as she often did these days, for what else had she to do? She went back to the time when she was a young girl, fresh out of school and starting her first job. She lived with her mother, father, sister and brother, and she was the eldest child. She had enjoyed a relatively normal childhood, although she was always a bit of a loner and had left school at the age of 15. Her father got her this job with a Miss Preston, who had a high-class gown shop. Father was a joiner by trade and had been working there when he heard that they were looking for a smart young girl to train. How excited she'd been after her interview. Mavis was the junior, but she loved it and was very happy there. That is until the dress owner got married, closed the dress shop and sold the building to the electricity board for office premises. She had 2 or 3 other jobs after that, but none were as good as the first one, and her confidence, which had never been great, dwindled. Then when she was 20 and least expecting such a thing to happen, her cousin introduced her to this handsome young man called James, and before long they were engaged to be married. How happy I was then, she thought. Unfortunately, things didn't work out, partly due to the interference from her mother and father, who didn't think that James was good enough for their daughter, but mainly because they lived so far apart from one another that they could only manage to travel to and fro at the weekends, which was too expensive. So after a while they broke off the engagement. Mavis frowned now as she remembered the arguments. She often wondered how different her life would have been had she been more outgoing and carried on with the relationship. I would love to have been married and had children, she sighed. Afterwards she had become more depressed and withdrawn than ever, so much that the family doctor sent her to hospital for tests to discover if her health problems were anything serious. Nothing was discovered, and so she went back to work, but not enjoying life very much. She remembered how she had always felt somewhat of an outsider and did not make friends very easily. Her sister and brother had married and moved away, so she was left at home with her parents, who, in a misguided fashion, did everything for her and tended to treat her like a child. This won't do, she thought, opening her eyes and looking at the clock again. Now what am I to do today? She picked up a diary and opened it at today's date. There was the list that she had made last night, as she did every night, ready for the following day. Wash up, have coffee and cig, make bed and dust the bedrooms, get lunch, iron, rest, coffee and cig. The list went on, the idea being that as she completed a task she would cross it out in the diary. This was a suggestion by a community nurse and was supposed to give her a sense of achievement. She smiled grimly. What achievement? She went back into the kitchen and let her mind start wandering again, while she washed up. She had a girl that came each week to do her shopping and another to liquidise her meals for the week, as she could not swallow solids and she was on a strict diet these days. They were her only regular contact with the outside world, apart from the radio and television. She had a telephone but no one to phone, no relatives and no friends. Holiday times were the worst. She would sit and look out of the window watching families going out and couples hand in hand, and sadly recall the time when she had had a family too. Her father had died very quickly 20 years ago, and that had left her and her mother together. They moved from the house they lived in into this flat, 3 stories up, the end one, so that after her mother died she became totally isolated. She tried to remember back to when she had her first panic attack. It had come on suddenly when she was at the hairdresser's, a few months before her father died. She found that she couldn't go on public transport after that and had a taxi to take her to and from work. But then she started having attacks at work, and before long she was medically retired. She could go out if she was with someone to take her, but that other than that she wouldn't step outside for anyone. "When I've gone, Mavis, what are you going to do?" her mother used to ask. But Mavis could not envisage a life on her own and ignored it, and of course, eventually her mother had died. Mavis's sister and brother both tried to get her to move somewhere where they would have company and encourage her to get involved in some sort of hobby, but it was useless. She didn't want to, and they couldn't force her. Eventually Mavis's sister, who had family problems of her own, moved away and lost touch. Her brother had a stroke, so he could not help her anymore. Mavis then became more lonely and isolated than ever, but stubbornly would not accept any help or advice from the authorities. She smiled as she dried the dishes and put them away in the cupboard. "I might not have been here now if my doctor hadn't called," she mused. "Perhaps it would have been better if she hadn't." Sighing deeply and wearily, she ran her fingers through her hair. Just over a year ago the doctor had called to give Mavis her annual check-up, saw that she looked very pale and took blood tests. The very next day the doctor came with the results, and consequently Mavis was rushed into hospital, where it was discovered that she had bowel cancer. Apparently she had been losing blood without realising it and needed a massive blood transfusion. She then had to have major surgery. In hospital she found it very nice to have the doctors and nurses fussing around her, and in a way she quite enjoyed it. "I wish I could have stayed there," she thought to herself. But no, soon it was time for her to be discharged, and back she came to her lonely and solitary life. Washing up finished, Mavis carried her cup of coffee into the lounge, lit a cigarette and looked across at the clock. 11:30. She reached for her diary and crossed out the second task that she had done. The silence in the flat was overpowering, but she didn't notice it anymore. After all, it was like this every day. Mavis suddenly looked across at the photograph of her mother and father that was standing on the shelf. "Well, this won't buy the baby a new bonnet, Mother," she said out loud. "Nearly lunchtime and I haven't made the bed yet." She jumped when she heard her voice sounding so loud in the empty flat. She often spoke out loud, mainly to the photographs dotted around, and going to the drawer she took out a duster and started on task number 3. When she had finished, she sat and crossed it out in her diary, then switched on the television for the lunchtime news and went into the kitchen to prepare her lunch. So there she is, poor lonely soul with nothing in her life to look forward to. Just the empty sameness, day after day, month after month, year after year. No one to talk to, seeing no one. How on earth can anyone cope with such a lonely existence? She does. She has no choice.